Thank you very much, Professor Robin McNeil, for the invitation. And thanks goes to everyone here for coming and giving me this opportunity to share my recent research with you. And today's topic is hardly new, hardly original. Basically, I'm trying to tell you that family is important, family life is important, intergenerational relationship in China has been improved, so on and so forth, all good news, nothing remarkable. Unless you know, I'm sure some of you know, the family institution used to be condemned as a bad thing, as some of the most radical intellectuals in China used to call it the square one of all evil things. So, in other words, the family institution, unlike its counterpart in the US, has been very much in the center of political, ideological struggles, and it also was one of the strategies that China pursued modernization, which is also something doesn't sound so extraordinary to us, because here I always feel this very personally even. Modernization in the US coming slowly, and many of us were born into modernization. I cannot imagine anybody here born before modernization. But people in China, like even in my generation, those people witnessed the arrival of modernity and modernization in a rather very fast, radical way. And yet that pursuit for modernization in China has, ever since the turn of the 19th century, has been almost like a holy grail that the entire nation was trying so hard to get, and even at whatever price it would take. Right? So if the price was to overthrow the imperial system and build a republic, they wanted to do it, and they did it. If the price was to have a new constitution, they tried, they did it. And then the price was figured to get rid of the family, and they tried to do it as well. So that's why the first point I want to quickly go over is the fall and the rise of the family. And this may not be a very rewarding part, because some of you know this part of history very well, others may not know well, so I'm trying to pitch in somewhere in the middle. But for those who know well, it's just too simple. For those who don't know at all, it's just too difficult, so bear with me with this part. And then I will go down to two case studies, which out of my own research. One is about urban youth in China, how their divorce was arranged by their parents. That one does sound interesting, right? And the second case study moved to the countryside in rural families. I described how intergenerational gap has been diminishing, and intergenerational relationship, even intimacy, began to appear. And so that's a second study. But then toward the last section, I will try to argue all of these seemingly good news may not indicating all good things, and there's a potential downside or even dark side of familism, or the resurgence of the Neo-Familism in China. Okay. Familism, as I use the term here, defined as a mode of a social organization in which the family works as a corporate group. If you imagine how a company operates, a family operates like that way, meaning there relies on a hierarchical arrangement of gender, sexual, and intergenerational relationship. And also in the case of China, there's hierarchy based on age as well. And therefore, the second defining point of familism is the interest of the family took over and overshadowed the interest of the individual. And the loyalty to family overshadowed loyalty toward any kind of social organizations. Therefore, if there in a society there is a strong familism, chances are there would be low social trust and a weak civic culture, because familism turned people inward. They trust only their own family members and not interested in public affairs, civic affairs, and not even engaging in much into civic activities. Hence, the notion of amoral familism put forward in 1958 by the Harvard political scientist Edward Banfield. And exactly, I jump over a little bit, but now in the West, ever since the 1990s, the term familism seems to be changed at least, and getting rid of some of its previous negative connotations, as we are increasingly emphasizing family values. And there is a turn, a return back to familism, family values in contemporary Western societies. Yet I want to point out that with that return of the family values in contemporary Western society, one thing we need to pay attention to, that is the family a means to an end, or the family is end in and of itself? And the bottom line is, whether the happiness of the individual is at the center. Why we want a family? In our contemporary Western society, probably family is a necessary means, if you believe in family values, to reach your individual happiness. You does not want to have a family for the sake of having a family. But that is not familism. Familism, by definition, means your individual interest, your individual happiness will be secondary to that of the family. Therefore, you must have a family. Okay, because of that compulsory and even oppressive nature of the family institution, back to the turn of the 19th century, many Chinese elites, both in the intellectual and the political circles, began to blame the family institution as one of the root causes of China's falling behind, become so backward and so weak. Therefore, they were calling for a complete family revolution to change the institution for the purpose of liberating the individual out of the family institution. Therefore, individuals could become independent and strong, and therefore to make up a strong independent nation, and therefore China could be modernized. So the logic is quite simple, and therefore for those who know this history very well, you recognize some names in the princes. Chen Duxiu, the first one, was also the first party secretary, general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. And he was among the first to call for family revolution. Hu Shi got his PhD in from Columbia University, was considered to be the representative of liberalism in China, and he used to work as the ambassador to the United States for the TMT government, and is on the other end of the political spectrum. He too was among those who called for family revolution. And Fu Sinian was a typical scholar, and served as the president of Taiwan National University, and he was the person who first called the family as the origin of all evils. So that was the trend, and yet despite all these intellectual efforts to get rid of the family and push for family revolutions until 1950s, nothing actually changed out there at the lower levels of the society or in social practices. Family revolution, by and large, remain as an ideological, cultural movement. And why? The simple reason was the familial mode of a social organization was not changed at all. Go to the very basic thing, production. economic activities were more or less still organized through family. All of this began to change after the Chinese Communist Party took national power in 1949 and to start the socialist transformations. And the first one of those important landmarks, the first one is 1950 marriage law. Purely in terms of the legal code, was probably not as not to be more radical than the 1930 marriage law, 1932 marriage law. But the difference, the major difference, was the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, was able to implement the 1950 marriage law, which was very liberal, banning parental arrangement of marriage, banning concubinage, marriage by purchase, and legally require marriage based on love, and have institute a marriage register system, so on and so forth, and legalize divorce, and leading to the first wave, divorce wave in China, which was mostly initiated by women. So all of this happened in the early 1950s, and then collectivization in the countryside, and also the nationalization of industry in the cities. Basically, for those who are not familiar with this history, this part of history, basically meaning gradually a sort of a state ownership of a property being established, not really public ownership, which may give us a misunderstanding. A state ownership of a property established, therefore the family was for the first time pushed out of the picture as a mode of economic activities and the social organizations. Ever since the 1950s, there has been also continuing ideological political campaigns aimed at, in Chinese discourse, aimed at feudalism and attacking patriarchal cultures, and also quite a number of family values based on that patriarchal culture and the patrilineal kinship system as well, reaching to the peak during the Cultural Revolution, meaning between 1966 to 1976. In the early years of Cultural Revolution, say from 66 to 69, and some of you might have heard of those cases that family members are reporting each other because they wanted to be loyal to Chairman Mao instead of being loyal to their parents. If they spot anything politically suspicious out of their parents, they would report it to the party, and the parents would do the same toward their children. So that would be considered to be the highest point of this anti-family revolution, state-sponsored, elite-led anti-family revolution in China. But that was only in the political and the ideological domain. In my own research, I did it mostly for research focusing on everyday life. So by the 1990s, that family revolution has indeed produced some positive results as well, leading to what I call a double transformation by the early 1990s. That is, the family, having been completely out of the public life, and has become increasingly a private haven for individual life, for individuals to pursue their family life, and to a certain extent, individual happiness as well. Therefore, love, intimacy, conjugal intimacy, and other notions like privacy even began to emerge in family life, which lead to what I call the privatization of the family. The family gradually being moved out of the public sphere. And also, the other side of this double transformation is the rise of the individual. By early 1990s, for the first time probably in the history, an individual would hesitate for a second. Wait a minute. Am I doing this for myself if I am doing this for myself, is that justifiable? How important it is to pursue my individual happiness. So those began to emerge. I'm not saying completely change, but I see these as very important indicators of radical change. So that's by the early 1990s. Then my book was published in 2003, so it's always almost 10 years behind. And then afterwards, continuing research and also my reading of secondary literature gradually caught my attention to new trends of change. And behind that, there is one important factor that is what is so-called the second demographic turn, meaning there is, along with the increase of life expectancy, the decline of fertility, a whole number of new fertility cultural values began to emerge. Children becomes valued as a treasure instead of being regarded as laborers. That's a very important thing. And it started with those who were born in the 1980s in China, who happened to be in the same time when the Chinese government implemented a single-child policy, mostly in the urban areas, but also have huge impact in the countryside, not necessarily leading to singleton child, still have certain impact. And then continue on to those who were born in the 1990s. In these 2 decades, children being born in China, in urban China, mostly have no siblings. So they are singletons. If you think about the family, think about the kinship system, that simple fact alone has huge implications. And they are also, as I just mentioned, treasured as the most valuable, treasurable thing in family life. So we even simply based on this very, very simple, straightforward fact, we see there's a certain change in intergenerational relationship. One is because the child becomes so valuable, and therefore the parents, one has been showering their mostly singleton child with comfortable material life, and parental protection, caring, love, all of those good things. But it's not, it doesn't go without a price. There is another side, that is a parental expectation. While showering all these good things onto their singleton child, parents also have high expectations of their child. They all wanted their child to be somebody. And I can tell you, in my generation, I was born in the 1950s, long time before many of you guys. And in my generation, I think most parents would hope the child would survive. That's it. If we survive, they grow up, that's very good. And then at the age of 14, I become a full-time laborer, helping my family. That's it. So, and therefore, more children, better happy family life, because more children, more laborers. This is different. More children, you cannot afford. Therefore, you concentrate on the singleton child, and then has a huge parental pressure to expect the child will thrive, will be successful. This has been shared by the entire population in China. Doesn't matter where they are. It could be on the top of the society in Beijing, Shanghai. Could be all the way to the bottom of rural China, but still share the same version, which is very, very important, but sometimes even very scary. Just imagine 1.3 billion people share the same version of what a good life should be. And another important thing, I was just talking with Professor McNeil before this, is the lack or the absence of ideological conflict across generational lines. If you look at the parents of the 80 nerds, 90 nerds who were born in these 2 decades, there's not much difference. They watch the same media, push the things, and TV programs, and then later on quickly absorbed into the new social media. And also, they all emerged into global consumerism. They were all interested in materialism. The only difference is parents are more focusing or interested in material in terms of wealth accumulation. They work very hard. They want to buy one property, after that a second, after that a third. And all of this is shared again by the entire nation. And then the children's generation probably are more interested in how to use the wealth to live a good life. But from my point of view, one way or the other is materialism. And because they share this materialism tendency, therefore talking about the power balance across intergenerational lines, it depends on who have the resources. Whoever have the resources will be in the upper hand position. So the previous arrangement of familism, that is hierarchy based on age, sex, and generation, were not that relevant today. Instead, it's resources, accumulation, and control. The last bullet point is a question mark. I wonder whether similar things are also happening here in the US. There is an intergenerational gap is disappearing. And we tend to have less conflicts with our parents. At least we don't have that much radical conflicts, meaning we totally have different world views with our parents. My observation is probably yes. And there are also reports on how many American youths after college live with their parents. Economics is one of the reasons they cannot afford the rent. But if your parents have a totally different worldview, you simply cannot stand them. I don't think those young people would be able to go back, live with their parents for a while. My guess is, this is a very radical guess, ever since the end of the Cold War, we were basically living happily or unhappily under global capitalism. There has not been a radical ideological difference which could push the younger generation totally out of their, away from their parents' generation, even in opposing direction. Think about the anti-Vietnamese War, 60s, 70s, even up to the 80s. There were still those factors that could divide the two generations, but those things are gone. This is just a sideline comment. Okay, now again, still a very general observation. The rise of Neo-Familism in public life in Chinese society. And one is the family becomes very important. And in the sense, one new thing is nowadays when talking about the family, people begin to include their parents from both sides. I'm talking about the young people, married couple. So once again, the extended family becomes increasingly important. But the difference is that in this wave of the rise of extended family, it's not necessarily only the male side. It could be the other side, wife's side, parents-in-law, from a man's point of view, living with the young couple. Or could it be from the both sides? So I will come back to this later. And then there are endless, I cannot say endless, many social surveys about trust. And result is, along with market economy, and social trust actually didn't go up, Instead, it has gone down, and yet parents as the family are always labeled as the most trustworthy social resources. It comes from my own research as well. Another very general indicator is during the recent decade of Chinese government's anti-corruption campaign, there's a new phenomenon, a new term popping up. It's called familial corruption. Meaning, if you take a closer look at any case of official corruption, behind that person, there's the entire family involved. And even beyond our normal definition of the family, because the chances are that corrupt official has at least one mistress. And that mistress was very likely the original push for official to embezzle public fund or doing public funding or doing something else. And then the children. Many corrupt officials later on, once they fail, they confess and saying, the motivation for me was to do something for my son or my daughter. I only have this child. So as long as my child can live a good life, I'm okay. So many officials would be were driven by this. Therefore, familiar mode of corruption has been recognized by the Chinese government, all the way going up to Xi Jinping, and they wanted to correct this. Whether they can do that or not is not beyond my scope of investigation, but I just use this as another factor to show how important family has become, especially for those who know knowing the history of the first 3 decades of China, New China PRC, 1950s, 60s, 70s. There were corrupt officials. There were cases of official corruptions. But if you look at the reasons, family was not there at all. Instead, those officials were very clean. They do things even, the first thing is that to push the family aside. They don't want to do anything for the interest of their family. Okay, another general marker is the pursuit for meaning of life, especially in the last 10 years or so. And many Chinese families have accumulated enough wealth to the point that they begin to feel their life or have become meaningless. And they wanted to add something on top of the pursuit of wealth and looking for the meaning of life. Yet, given the political social conditions in China in the last decade or so, the civic spirit or public sphere have not been developed much in the last decade. When people trying to find the meanings of life, hardly they can find anything meaningful or worth of pursuing outside the family circle. So they turn inward. And then the family, once again, becomes a very important thing for that reason. Okay, so those who were looking from the society's angle to look at the rising importance of the family. But now if we switch to an individual's angle, my angle, your angle, say from a very early time, the family or parents becomes very important. For the younger generations, 1980s, 18ers, 19ers, ever since their time they are going to kindergarten, their parents would get involved to choose the best kindergarten, the best primary school, the best high school, so that their singleton child can go to the best university. And the most radical one I saw last year, early this year, was in a case, this is elite kindergarten. They only recruit 10 children every year. And they only recruit 10 children born in January every year. So parents, in order to make sure their child being recruited into this elitist, very elite kindergarten, they wanted to plan their pregnancy, making sure their child being born in January. Being interviewed, one mother said, literally in Chinese, let me say it in Chinese first. 我们必须要赢在射精前。So they wanted to win before the departure point, the starting line. Therefore, where is the starting line? What is the term? Impregnation? Yes? Okay. So you have to plan when you eject, and then in order to make sure your child being born in that month. So this is too radical. But it says something about this early education, the involvement of parents, right? And then make choice. So before college graduation, parents are pushing their children, singletons, to concentrate on study. But right after the commencement, parents turn to another target. Have you had a girlfriend yet? A boyfriend yet? And he said, I've been studying. How can I have a boyfriend? Now it's time to have one. So switch to the second task. I'm pushing for marriage. Therefore, parental involvement in both negative form, the veto power, or the positive form, trying to do matchmaking thing, becomes very important. And I don't know, for those who follow Chinese media, you must know this Jinping show. And this is called the Chinese dating, right? And it's very hot. Why? Because Jinping, who is a transgender artist, and she was able to catch this parental involvement as a new, very significant social change. Therefore, she has this show, inviting parents coming to choose the spouse for their children, a child. So it's basically parents making decisions. I strongly recommend you go to watch this show. That's the girl being selected or being chosen by a whole number of parents. That's one of the parents sitting together with their son. Their son was in a separate room, had no power to say anything, just watching how their parents, his parents, to choose the date for him. This is a photo of a very old practice. Some of you might visit this place as well. People's Park in Shanghai, actually everywhere in every big city, small city in China. Now you have this as a matchmaking corner in the park, and where they display the information of their child, mostly singleton child, in order to find a mate. I want to remind the audience, not long ago, in 1950s, it was the opposite. Young Chinese youth fought very hard against the parental arrangement as a part of their liberation. This is a movie made based on a Ping play of northern China. And it's a very famous actress. This is a very famous heroine, a figure called Liu Qiao'er. And this caption says, after thinking it again and again, now I have made my final decision. That is cancel the previous engagement made by her parents and pursue her own love. So the thing is that this is 1950. Now, nearly 70 years later, we have parents finding the spouse for their children. And then I'll quickly go over this. I think I'm running out of time. Marriage, the excessive cost of marriage in contemporary China. For this, I'm always been doing research on this single phenomenon. There's how much it costs to get married in China, and especially in the form of bride wealth. Just keep going up, 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 up. And without those necessary items, especially young men can simply cannot get married. And therefore, all parents are anxious to prepare for this. I have a friend, a young friend in Shanghai at Fudan University, 30 years old. He just got his son born early this year. And in order to prepare this, he's a young faculty. He spent 2.5 million Chinese currency, buy a nice small apartment, not nice, actually I want to say the other way, an old small apartment next to Fudan campus. It's a school district. And then After the born of the new baby, he realized this is a son. So his son needs a car. Therefore, he has been bidding for the second car license. In Shanghai, you have to get into this lottery in order to bid for a license plate. He already had his. So just 2 weeks ago, he recharged to us saying, I happily got my second car license plate. That's for 20 years later. I was telling him, maybe 20 years later, Shanghai government changed the policy, right? And then now he's talking about getting another big house for his son. So all of this, marriage becomes increasingly costly and putting pressure on parents, and then post-marriage residence, child rearing, all of this are whole family involved. You cannot do any of this without your parents or her or his parents involved. Even about divorce. You cannot divorce alone. You have to be involved your parents, and chances are the divorce was pushed by the parents. That's my case study. Parents-driven divorce. The intriguing point is the younger generation of Chinese appear to be more independent in some parts of their life, right? They receive the most updated information, living the most updated consumerist lifestyle, and many of them did dye their hair into blue or green, and so on and so forth. But comes to important decisions, interesting things that they still go back, look for their parents' support. And here are some basic figures. Basically, among divorce cases, 40% of the divorce were cases involving the 18ers, meaning the 18ers generation probably is having higher divorce rate. And the more interesting thing is that a high percentage of those divorcing young couples would have their parents involved, and nearly more than half of them would have their parents representing them in the court. And there are cases their parents were fighting, parents from both sides were fighting very hard against each other. There's a young couple sitting out there among the audience playing with their cell phone. Almost like it's not their case, because actually by the time they go to court, the young couple already reconciled. But it's too late. Both parents decided to push for divorce, and then they went forward. So much so that the Chinese media began to say there is this 父母三包. It's the further development from 父母包办, meaning parental arranged marriage. Now it's a parental arranged divorce in 3 very important aspects. That is whether a couple should get divorced, or how to divide the common property after divorce, and then who is going to raise the child, the young child in the 3rd generation. Okay, I need to go very quickly tell you the factors from my point of view. Just reading the main title probably. One is excessive parental interference and supervision of their singleton's life, everyday life. Parents are doing this, they mean good, they mean well. They want to take care of their children. For instance, in one extreme case, the mother, after her son got married, the mother still worried because his son tended to throw his comfort onto the ground during sleep. So every night, mother will come into their bedroom to make sure his son didn't do that. Now he's married, right? So much so that the young daughter-in-law eventually cannot bear them anymore. Say, mother, why don't you just move to sleep in this room together with us? Surprising to her, next night, his mother moved in. So the next move would be to demand a divorce, right? And this is the one thing. This leads to the second, that is parents, because of their previous investment of caring, love, and financial resources into their singleton child. so much that they cannot think otherwise. That is, after getting married, a conjugal interest would be different from a single child's interest, because a conjugal unit, it has its own interest. That interest needed two parties, husband and wife, to make some compromises. Yet the parents cannot recognize that, so they insist on to protect their singleton's personal interest in the child's marriage. That's another reason. Whenever there's a push, they only push for the personal interest, which is in the opposite direction to the conjugal interest. Of course, if parents are doing this and the young generations are resisting, they don't need to as strongly resisting as the 1950s, 60s generation. If they do something, it couldn't be that going that far. But yet, the younger generations entirely rely on their parents. Even when they have quarrels with their own spouse, they would go back to talk to their parents. And then you can imagine when a daughter or a son talking to her or his mother complaining about the spouse, what the parent would say? Probably no good words. And therefore, there's another reason. But behind of this is the younger generation only trust their parents. I ask the issue again, a question again and again. Hypothetically, before your spouse and your parents, who would be more trustworthy? Of course, my parents. My parents' love are entirely, wholeheartedly love of me. My spouse, maybe somewhere. So that's the important thing and to watch. The last one is economics. Parents involve too much into the economic base of the new conjugal unit. Therefore, anything goes wrong, parents cannot bear with it. So these are the four major reasons of my first case study. And I think the second one, I should go even faster. This is about rural case. So, I'm okay? All right. So this is the 4 points of this entire case study, published in 2 articles. One is over the last 2 the departure point is, again, the improvement of the intergenerational relationship. Because in the 1990s, scholars talked about the crisis of filial piety. And some scholars even observed old people, parents commit suicide because they couldn't bear with the miserable life in their old age anymore. And me too. I wrote about the decline of filial culture, and today I don't think I was wrong like 2 decades ago. And just the things have changed. And now it seems that crisis has gone. Instead, intergenerational relationship has been improved a lot. And meanwhile, the new thing is what I call the intergenerational intimacy. Adult married children in the countryside shared a lot of laughters, conversations with their aged parents. They took their parents to tourism, going to visit other places, the entire family. Those things were unheard of, at least in the rural area I work. And so then I just wanted to find out why. One reason is basically the 2 generations worked together, redefined what filial piety should be. Filial piety in traditional Chinese culture is based on 3 things. One is the continuity of the descent line. You need to do well in human reproduction. Not any kind, only one kind to produce sons. If you don't, you failed your life. You are not filial. This is the number 1 thing. Number 2 thing is ritual sacrifices, worship, all this. And then along with that is this very important other aspect, that is absolute respect and obedience of parents, by extension, any senior kin. So that's a very important thing, is unconditional obedience and respect. Parents are always right. Even they are wrong, you have to basically say, you're right. And then you can not carry through in action, but you cannot disrespect your parents. Argue or talk back to them. Of course, care and support in the parents' old age is another important effect. So, 20 years later, the third factor is no longer that critical anymore because the improvement of living standards in general. So, hardly you find, at least in the area I'm familiar with, and old parents cannot survive economically. In the cities, it's even better. Parents have actually more resources than their adult married children. What has changed is the second point about this absolute respect and obedience to parents. Over the last 2 decades, it gradually shifted. The older generation began to give up that expectation. And the younger generation began to redefine this as long as I make my parents not worried about my life, make them happy because I'm having a happy life, that's called filial piety. So, let me repeat this again. If being respected or being obeyed considered to be part of individual happiness in traditional filial patrilineal culture, so that one was centered on the parents' generation, or even further back onto ancestors. You work hard to glorify your ancestors. You don't get any reward in the instant and the real sense, but you get a reward in the delayed sense, meaning when you become a parent, become an ancestor, you will be worshipped, you will be respected. So it's almost like a good Christian working hard for the glory of God, not for the present life. But over the last 2 decades, this began to change. Simply, along with early change, another one I mentioned, that is after the single-child policy, children becomes much more treasured, and the parental love, caring, showering toward the children. So instead of treating them as laborers. Therefore, children's happiness has indeed become parents' happiness. And I ask both sides, because in the first place, I thought this is just the rhetoric of the young adult, because they wanted to enjoy a good life. Then I go back to ask parents. Parents say, yeah, what's the purpose of us working so hard? They are happy. Therefore, we are happy. So it's almost like a redefinition of a filial piety. Plus, the ritual sacrifices are no longer that important, and then economic shortage or poverty have become less relevant. So putting all this together, and then the two generations can easily find a common ground. And more than that, this child-centered culture, a new family culture, continue to develop and being switched to the third generation. When the 18ers, now the 19ers began, have their own child, or some in cases children, that third generation become the new focal point. Both the senior generation, meaning the grandparents, and the parents, put all resources onto the third generation. It becomes a new centripetal power center, absorb all love, caring, and efforts. Speaking of efforts, I always have a sort of weird observation. That is, a Chinese family has to be a unit of fighting, must have something to do. If entirely as a unit of enjoy life, Chinese family will fall apart. And if I have something to fight for, to work for, the family would unite, work very hard. Now you have one, and a new grandchild. I'm not joking. If you look at when is the best time for Chinese couple to divorce? Of course, it is a funny assumption. Chances are, when their children grow up, they go to the best college, everything goes so well, now the couple sit down saying, let's talk about divorce. I tolerated you for 20 plus years. And she said, me too. Why? Because they have done all their life tasks. They finished. All those things must be completed. Now they can take care of themselves. Now, with this new focus in the third generation, family struggle continue on as more meaningful, right? And so this last one we talk later. But basically, this is the three major points I talked in those two articles. I go into details and ethnographic details. I think I don't want to bore you guys with those details. I should quickly move on to. Now, with all those things I just reported, I still call it Neo-Familism instead of Neo-Familism. Reason is, unlike the Neo-Familism in contemporary Western society in which individual happiness is at the center, is the end, family, how important it is, regardless how important it is a means to an end. That end is your happiness, my happiness. And but in the Chinese case, just as in the case I talk about these three generations working together for the grandchildren to grow, it's not, the family is not a means to an end. The family remains to be an end in and of itself. So there is the rising aspect of the individual, but the individual still being subsumed under this collectivity of the family group. Therefore, I call it Neo-Familism. But there, of course, there's this tension. Unlike in old days, and family absolutely took the primacy and supremacy over individuals. But now you have these individuals rising, including the increasing importance of intimacy, emotions, affections in Chinese family life. This is another new thing I'm working on. Okay, three things are very important for us to understand what I just reported at the larger society. One is from the nation-state point of view, the new leadership has been reassessing the family as a possible strategy to realize Xi Jinping's Chinese dream. Again, if you go back to the very early point I made, the family as a strategy of pursuing modernization by the nation state in China. Now you see it coming back. And Xi Jinping has given a lot of speeches, and this is a website from the Chinese Communist Party's Central Disciplinary Committee. And I think this is mostly aimed at familial corruption, that phenomenon. But in other contexts, Xi Jinping also emphasizing on the importance of the family, family rules, family ethos, all those things. And so much so it become part of the Xi Jinping Code. I think eventually there will be a book on Xi Jinping Code, and there's a family code on the family will be there. And the second is side by side with the state refocus on the family. There is this from bottom up at societal level resurgence or revitalization of a traditional Chinese culture, Confucian ethics. In some cases, exactly the same kind of Confucian ethics that the main fourth generation in the turn of 19th century were fighting against. They're coming back, such as filial piety, such as absolute obedience of women to men. All those are coming back. And that is another interesting factor we should pay attention to. It's a photo. It goes back. It's an opening ceremony at a elite primary school in Hangzhou, and where children being dressed up in this traditional way, and they have these rituals called all sorts of things. 2014, ever since Xi Jinping began to promote traditional Chinese culture, there has been a nationwide campaign of all sorts pushing for this. This is in Qufu and Confucius' hometown. And they have these training camps for learning Confucianism. This would remind, for those who went to China in the 70s, 80s, maybe, those old practice, communist practice of 学习班 and study groups, and you're being totally indoctrinated into this. And in this particular one is on the notion of filial piety. Okay, this is the second factor. The third factor is the arrival of a risk society at China. And something like what I studied once about food safety issues. And there are some other things, similar things. China become just like a contemporary modern West is also into this stage, become a society filled with unknown risks, uncertainties. And therefore, this factor also affecting people's pursuit for meaning of life, pushing them toward the family as a coping strategy. Okay, this is the last slide. Going back to my first slide, with all of this, thinking about civic life, public sphere, if familism is by definition not going to be aligned with public sphere, a healthy, booming public sphere, and active civic life, now what would happen in China as familism, neo-familism being pushed? And is there a potential uncivil side of the kind of familism emerging in China? Particularly, if we take consideration of what I observed, there's this shift from ancestor-centered to grandchild-centered. In the past, in traditional Chinese culture, the lineage-based Chinese kinship system actually has an aspect of public life, because you have ancestors who were long dead, being the focal point, and the descendants could unite at least within the boundaries of the in-group people within that kin group. They unite surrounding the ancestors. Here, Professor Sangren is the absolute authority on that traditional Chinese cultural aspect. But now, it's a grandchild-centered. Each extended family has only one, maximum two. It doesn't go to somebody else's grandchild. So that public aspect cannot be established, or can hardly establish through this, right? If you connect this with another one, the next bullet point, China at the same time is marching very fast along the market economy track, becoming increasingly a society, open, mobile of society. Factoring into that factor in, familism, neo-familism may not necessarily mean all good things. Thank you very much for your patience.